Welcome, everybody. This interesting thing on Zoom, watching people virtually enter our space. So I do welcome you to Connection Builds Resilience, a webinar focused on trauma-informed care for young children. My name is Jackie Eaton, and I work at the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, who is hosting this webinar. And my role is Community Action Program for Children, or CAPC, Training and Education Coordinator. So I support the CAPC projects across the province who are working in a variety of different settings, including many directly with young children, many were supporting parents and supporting families, focused on the social and health of children age 0 to 6. So this topic is extremely important for all of the people attending that are from CAPC. And I know this has been one of the most requested topics that we've had, looking at trauma-informed care, working with young children. So I am joined today by Kara Taylor, who is the founder and therapist and mental health educator, and she is with Oaks Mental Health. So she will be starting shortly, but before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. So I am currently participating from Treaty 6 in the homeland of the Métis, and I would like for everyone just to take a moment to pause and to give thanks for all that this land means to each and every one of us. I was looking at today's topic and was thinking how it's always important to do land acknowledgement, and I feel honored to be able to express my appreciation and gratitude to the land and those that have come before. But thinking about this topic in particular, it hit my heart even a little bit more. So as I mentioned, I work at the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, and we provide services to treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. And it is wonderful to have people from the various ancestral territories of the Nahiawuk, Nahithawuk, Nahinawuk, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Anishinaabeg, Nicoay peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis. We acknowledge that the treaties of these lands and reaffirm the responsibilities and commitments to healthy relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. At the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, we are committed to understanding the history of colonialism and playing a positive role in the important process of truth and reconciliation. So I invite you, if you are comfortable, to share in the chat what treaty land you are participating in from, and I will now pass it on to Kara. Sorry,
Hello.
before I get Kara to start, I forgot to mention about questions. Kara said she is welcome to take questions throughout, so please use the Q&A box for your questions, and then I will interrupt Kara so that I can ask those questions. You also would have noticed that this, as soon as you came in, you would have had to acknowledge that this session is being recorded. I will be sending out the recording link to all registrants when it's available in a couple of days. Right.
All right, perfect. I'm just going to spotlight my video here. So welcome here to Connection Builds Resilience, Trauma-Informed Care for Young Children. My name, as mentioned just a moment ago, is Kara Taylor, and I'm just going to do a brief introduction before we dive into some things here. So I have a background in social work. I have a master's degree and a bachelor's degree in social work, and much of my professional experiences, almost all of them, I suppose, have revolved around mental health and trauma, in the sense of mental health and trauma are very connected and affect one another, and you can't really talk about one without talking about the other. And so I've worked in a diversity of settings. I've worked in a psychiatric hospital. I've worked on mobile crisis response. I currently work as a therapist with a private practice, and I've been doing that for 4 years as well. And in beyond the academic and professional things that I've experienced, I also like to acknowledge that I have lived experience of trauma, of mental illness. I've lost a loved one to suicide. And why I like to acknowledge those things is because the personal and professional often intersect in the sense that trauma-informed care for young children or talking about mental health in general is not something that's only relevant to us in a professional sphere. It's also relevant to us personally, whether that's with children we have in our lives in a professional capacity or a personal capacity. And this is relevant in all contexts. So I just like to identify that intersection as we're talking about these things. As mentioned, I am happy to take questions throughout the presentation. If I am going to touch on your question later in the presentation, then I will just say we are going to get to that. And then if you still have the question or would like clarification after I've touched on the topic, then please do ask. I really value and appreciate questions because I think that this stuff isn't black and white. It's often gray in nature in the sense that there's no formula I can give you to tell you this is how this goes 100% of the time. There's only like context and things to consider, but you always need to use your own discernment, your own awareness of the situation, the unique relationship you have with a child, and the unique relationship um, in terms of, how you might approach a situation is going to look different than somebody else. So I'll give you some themes and perspectives to consider, but I can't give you, as I said, a formula. But I do think that questions help us grapple with like, how does this really work in this context? So please know all types of questions are welcome, and I'll do my best to give some context to whatever questions you bring. So starting out here, I think we need to look at, in general, what is trauma. So, trauma, I'm going to define just for all people in general, in terms of like adults, children, etc. Because as adults, our trauma histories also affect our capacity to be present for children with their trauma histories, as well as being triggered by certain things, which can bring us into a trauma response, which can affect how we're able to be present with children. So, I want to touch on trauma in general, and I will note that if anything in this presentation brings up some discomfort in you that feels like, this is a bit too much, or I can't really do this right now, please feel free to step away and just acknowledge what you need in that moment. And it's okay if you need time and space from this. You could watch the recording later, or you can say, you know what, I think this is a bit too much for where my head's at right now. And that's totally okay. So just please be mindful of what you need in this moment here. Okay. So, what is trauma? So, whoever experiences trauma, it overwhelms our capacity to cope. And so, depending on the person and depending on the circumstances, the social supports we have, the resources we have, different people in different situations are going to be overwhelmed and unable to cope. And what I mean by that is you could have, say, two children who go through the same thing, and one of them may not be able to have the capacity to cope and feel really overwhelmed. And the other child might not experience it the same way and might not be as overwhelmed or have a greater capacity to cope with what is going on. And the same thing is with adults, is two events in and of themselves. You can't say, this is traumatic for you, and it should be traumatic for everyone, or this isn't traumatic for you, so it shouldn't be traumatic for anyone. It's different depending on a number of factors, and we'll talk about what makes kids more able to cope with difficulties, difficult situations, traumatic events, that kind of thing, okay? But in general, it overwhelms your capacity to cope, and we also have to think about what's developmentally appropriate for different ages. So something that I might experience as a child could be a lot more overwhelming even if I experience the same thing as an adult, because I'm a lot more vulnerable as a child, and also I am still learning how to regulate my emotions. My brain is still developing, and I'm a lot more susceptible to, you know, if I don't have an adult taking care of me, it's like I am dealing with that on my own, and that's going to be a lot harder as a child versus as an adult. In general, traumatic events can be really part of what makes them so overwhelming is they're events we cannot predict, escape, control, or prevent. So it really leaves you feeling out of control, and your brain often is trying to make sense of how did this happen to me, or why is this happening to me? And as children, we often create a story that in order to keep our attachment with our parents or our caregivers, that if I'm being treated badly, it's because there's something bad about me. And so children who experience trauma get this sense of I'm the problem and I need to change how I'm behaving so that I can, be treated well or like get through or survive this situation. And that can often be carried into adulthood. I work with a lot of adults who have this belief from childhood that there's something wrong with them, that they are the bad person, that they are the bad thing, even if they know logically that's not true. But what that emotionally conveys to them when they've gone through ongoing trauma is that there's often something wrong with them. It also alters our sense of safety and self-efficacy. So self-trust is really shattered, especially in relational trauma. And this sense of I can't be safe in the world with other people. We start to become more hyper vigilant or hyper aware of possible threats around us. It also causes difficulty with regulating emotions. We can have these big emotions that flood us in moments that seem like they're small triggers, right? And what I often say too is that when we have a big emotional response to something that's small, it tells us that it's associated with something big in our past, right? Because I don't believe that anyone, children or adults, are ever being over dramatic. I think that if we look underneath the surface of what's going on for a child or an adult, is there is something that makes sense there for them, like why they're acting that way. Maybe, it triggers or reminds them of something that was really traumatic in the past, even if it's not the same thing. So the classic example of this that you might have heard of is, let's say we have a soldier come home from overseas, and the soldier hears a car backfiring and they dive into a bush because their brain says, this sounds like, the gunfire, the trauma that was happening. We were unsafe in that situation. So I'm going to put you into flight mode, like get away, escape the situation. The car backfiring is not actually unsafe, but there was a big reaction from that veteran. Why did that happen? Because the brain is like, I need to keep you safe because this reminds me of a past trauma, even though everything was actually okay in that moment. So you might see a big reaction in a child or even an adult and might be like, why are they reacting like that? Like nothing's dangerous right now. But it makes sense given what they've been through and how the brain coded that experience. Okay. And then lastly, trauma often cannot be made sense of. We can't find a why, we can't find a reason. And that's often why we go to a place of guilt instead of going to a place of, oh, well, I was completely powerless and couldn't do anything about it. That's a lot more scary to have no power or control over what has happened. Trauma often leads to big questions of, can I trust myself to keep myself safe? Can I trust my perception of things if I've experienced a lot of gaslighting? Can I trust other people? Because, when you're a child, your parents or caregivers are meant to keep you safe. And if they aren't keeping you safe, that can be incredibly confusing. What does that mean about you? What does that mean about the world? And children to survive need to continue to have an attachment to their parents or caregivers even if they're being hurt by their parents or caregivers. And so that can create a really complicated roadmap for how to navigate relationships in the future. Okay, so maybe I've been treated negatively by my parents or caregivers, and then I just expect that's how I'm meant to be treated in relationships as a whole. I get into toxic relationships, etc., etc. Um, can I trust the creator or God? So there can be spiritual implications of, why didn't God take care of me? Why didn't the creator protect me? Is the world an unsafe place? Do I need to be constantly on guard or hyper vigilant? Is my life meaningful now that this has happened to me? Am I valuable? Because if I'm valuable, if there's nothing wrong with me, why would I be treated this way? What happened? Why did this happen? So those are really vulnerable, difficult questions that trauma can lead to. There are different types of trauma, and the two here that I really want to emphasize today, talking about children, are the complex repetitive trauma and developmental trauma. So, you might be familiar of like a single incident trauma, and that's where, say, someone experiences a specific event in time, maybe like a car accident or an assault, maybe a natural disaster of some kind, that we could say, yeah, that was a traumatic event. But complex and repetitive trauma is a bit different in the sense that it's ongoing. You are trapped in this traumatic situation, relationship on an ongoing basis. And so that is a bit different than just having a single incident event happen to you. And you're much more likely to develop PTSD or complex PTSD from like repetitive or ongoing trauma. Similarly, developmental trauma would be when the parts of your brain are developing and are still being shaped and being formed. So, earlier ongoing repetitive trauma that children experience literally changes how their brain forms and how their brain makes sense of the world. It's kind of like the roadmap thing that I kind of used before, is like your brain is learning how to navigate relationships how to be in the world, what the world is like, what you should do to survive in the world. And if you create that roadmap based on a fear-based system, that's going to look very different than a child who creates a roadmap based on of like how to navigate life, on a sense of safety, on a sense of, I can trust people, I can feel safe in my body, I can feel safe in my home, I can feel safe in the places that I go, etc. So developmental trauma has a profound, lasting impact on children's development, on their brains, etc. It doesn't mean we can't do things to help build resilience, though. And it doesn't mean that we would look at children as too far gone. We don't want to have that perspective. Kids and children, they have like our brains are all we have a lot of neuroplasticity, especially kids, right? And so we can make meaningful changes even if kids have experienced a lot of trauma in their life to help bring healing and to help kind of bring their brain to a healthier place. So I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, it's like too far gone. There's nothing we can do, that kind of thing. There's definitely ways that we can promote resilience and healing, even if kids have gone through quite a bit of trauma. Another type of trauma that we should acknowledge as well is intergenerational and historical trauma. So, intergenerational trauma, in very simple terms, it's like these psychological or emotional effects that are kind of passed down from generation to generation. So, for example, say someone experienced a lot of trauma when they were growing up, and then they developed an addiction to cope with that trauma, because we know addiction and trauma are often very intertwined. And then the addiction made it so that they were less able to be present for their children. Their children experience traumatic, situations as a result of that, potentially go into foster care, etc. And so that's a way that this trauma is kind of being passed down through generations. But it's very important to look at the historical context. That's why I have that image kind of overlapping the two, because particularly in Saskatchewan, what we need to acknowledge is like the colonialism, the cultural genocide, the way that there's been this like massive group trauma for Indigenous people here in Saskatchewan and Canada and beyond. And so they're very intertwined with one another. And we have to look at, okay, it's complicated when there's been this huge cultural wounding and the sense of a culture being suppressed, a culture trying to be destroyed or completely annihilated, really. If we look back at the context of like the 60s scoop, if we're looking at residential schools, etc. So we need to see how that gets passed on and how that affects people, in next generations. I think a really interesting study to highlight just how much intergenerational trauma can be like passed down, not even just like in terms of the behaviors we experience from our parents, but also in terms of how it changes the genetics that we pass on from one generation to the next, is they took these mice in a study and they would shock the mice every time they put the cherry blossom scent, out to the mice. And eventually they could see that even when they put the cherry blossom scent out and there was no shock, the mice would have a stress response. So we see that before. That makes sense. It's where we start to learn that something is dangerous, even if the dangerous thing doesn't happen, and it elicits a stress response in us. Okay. The next thing that they did was they bred the mice so that they were like, for lack of a scientific term, the grandchildren mice. And the grandchildren mice had never experienced the shock and cherry blossom association, but they put the cherry blossom scent out with like no association established beforehand. And the grandchildren mice actually had an elevated stress response to that smell, even though it was their grandparents who had had that association created. So it's like it was actually meant to be a protective mechanism passed on, because grandparent mice experienced basically trauma and pain associated with the cherry blossom smell. So that was passed on through generations to be wary of that smell because it was associated with trauma and harm, right? Just gonna check okay. I'm just gonna go here. All right. So, something that's important to look at when we're talking about childhood trauma and that you may be familiar with if you've had conversations or training on trauma informed care is adverse childhood experiences. So, this was a huge study done in the States where they looked at a number of traumatic childhood experiences, also known as adverse childhood experiences, and they determined what people's ACE score was and the associated outcomes with the score that was given. So they looked at people, for example, who had the following things happen to them. These questions were asked of them. And for every question you answer yes to, you add a point to your score. So if you were to say yes to the to three of the following questions, you would have an A score of 3. If you said yes to 8 of them, you would have an A score of 8. Okay. And this is just to provide context of just how common developmental trauma can be, or how common childhood trauma is. Okay. So, did a parent or adult in your home ever hit, beat, kick, or physically hurt you in any way? So, was there physical abuse? Did a parent or adult in your home ever swear at you, insult you, or put you down? So, verbal abuse. Did you experience unwanted sexual contact? So, sexual abuse. Did you feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, or had no one to protect you or take care of you? So, neglect. Did you feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were special? Emotional neglect here. Did you live with anyone who was depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide? And this was put in the category of household dysfunction. So, households that had a lot of stress, a lot of difficulty that can cause just traumatic experiences for the family as a whole. Did parents or adults in your home ever hit, punch, beat, or threaten to harm each other? Domestic violence. Did you live with anyone who had a problem with drinking or using drugs, including prescription drugs? So, addiction. Did you live with anyone who went to jail or prison? So, having an incarcerated caregiver or sibling. Did you lose a parent? So, separation through divorce, abandonment, death, or another reason. So we're looking at physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, and then the following types of household dysfunction. And the thing that's important to note is this isn't every possible type of childhood trauma, but this is just what they looked at in the study. Importantly, there are considerations of these things that should be added to the original ACE study. And this probably isn't completely inclusive as well, but witness community violence. So, in neighborhoods and communities, felt discrimination based on gender, based on race, based on religion, whatever it might be, adverse neighborhood experiences, being bullied, or living in foster care. So, they're looking at adding these in terms of looking at further studies with ACE scores. But I wanted to give you some information about a Canadian context because this study was originally done in the United States. But in Canada, this is research from 2021. And this is just an example of how common it can be. This was for people ages 45 to 85. They looked at how many ACEs they had experienced, just to kind of get context. So 60% of Canadians have experienced at least one ACE, and 13% of women in Canada have experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. 8% of men have also experienced 4 or more, and the most common types of adverse childhood experience would be physical abuse, domestic violence, and emotional abuse. But really startling, which was really startling to me, was that last one where more than 15% of Canadians have experienced sexual abuse under the age of 18. And that number is likely the study says that number is likely to be higher, but that's just what they can kind of verify, a conservative estimate. So very common childhood trauma. And with this idea and awareness that childhood trauma is very common, it means that we need to practice trauma informed care as a universal precaution. So, not every child that we're interacting with will have experienced childhood trauma, but they might have. And we don't know that, and we can't know that, nor is it always appropriate to know that to kind of dive into the history of, what went on for this child. Sometimes we do that, get that context that helps us understand, but we want to be compassionate, supportive, even if we don't know the history of a child. And we want to treat all children as if they could have experienced trauma in their past, and to practice in a trauma informed way to help all kids feel safe, even when they have big emotions or big behaviors that are difficult for us. So it's a universal approach and precaution, not just for the kids that we think have a trauma history. Okay. So now going a bit more specific into children, that was kind of like trauma in general, adverse childhood experiences, and may have also reminded you of experiences you've had, as you might have, you know, whatever your score might have been. It's good to take note of. But the stress response in the body is essentially when something stressful or challenging happens, our brain will initiate the stress response. So our bodies kind of go into action here, and what that looks like physiologically, and this is true of both children and adults, is there's our warning sign there, which means a threat or a challenge of some kind. And this might be like a mild challenge because stress responses aren't always negative. They can help us adapt and change and thrive in certain environments. But basically, what happens is our brain is like, okay, so we need to get mobilized here to deal with this threat head on. So our brain is going to communicate to our adrenal glands to turn on adrenaline and cortisol. And that adrenaline and cortisol is what is going to communicate to the rest of the body. And it's meant to be, it's a hormone that isn't specific to just like one part of the body. That's why we feel it all across our body. We might notice that we start breathing more quickly. Our liver is actually going to be converting more glucose into energy. So we can be more like hyper aware, focused on what's going on. Our heart beats faster, digestion shifts, which can lead to like nausea, feeling uncomfortable in our stomach. Our muscles can get tense. We can start to feel warmer as a whole because this initiates a response of fight or flight in our bodies. So it's mobilizing us to either meet the threat head on, which would be the fight response, or to escape the thing that's scary, which would be the flight response. And we need more energy to do both of those things to either physically, overcome or attack the thing in front of us, or to literally run away and escape what's happening. So there are three types of stress responses in children, and there can be positive, tolerable, or toxic. So positive stress responses are actually helpful short-term boosts in energy and alertness. So cortisol, which we know is the stress hormone, actually helps us wake up in the morning. So having some cortisol rise in your body is what helps you actually awaken for the day. And it actually mobilizes us in when it's in like a healthy range or like in small amounts to meet everyday challenges. If we had no cortisol or cortisol wasn't rising appropriately in our bodies, that would not be good. And it can lead to health issues, that sort of thing. So, again, an everyday positive stress response isn't necessarily a bad thing. And maybe it's like going somewhere you've never been before, meeting someone new, stepping out of your comfort zone. Might feel a little uncomfortable, but it's not going to feel like intolerable. And it's going to feel like, okay, I'm going to maybe get a little excited about this, maybe get slightly nervous, but I can meet the challenge in front of me and my body is changing or adapting to help me do that. Okay. So for kids, positive stress response, not completely overwhelming or debilitating, and it's something that helps them meet the challenges before them. Tolerable stress is something that does cause notable emotional distress. So let's say a child is moving to, a different house or moving to a different city, going to a different school where they don't know anyone, and they might have big emotions as a result of that. This leads to higher levels of these stress hormones, feeling really overwhelmed, maybe really angry, anxious, sad, disconnected. But the key part of what makes a stress response tolerable is it's a short elevation, like relatively, that return to normal once the stressor is over or adapted to. Okay. And events that are traumatic their impact can be diminished if the stress is tolerable. So we're going to talk about tolerable stress and toxic stress. You could have the same thing happen in both instances, and one child might experience that stress as very upsetting, very uncomfortable, very harmful, but tolerable. Whereas the other type of stress would be toxic and have long-term negative impacts. And I'm going to talk about what differentiates the two shortly here, though. But again, this can be triggered by the same events that trigger toxic stress. So tolerable stress, though, is we do get stress hormones going back to a normal place. Okay, it's not like long-term, ongoing. There's never a break in that stress response, etc. So toxic stress is where the body's in a chronically stressed state. There's lots that fight or flight response. You're in a chronic place of being hypervigilant, of constantly adapting to challenge, constantly adapting to fear in your environment, etc. It can lead to ongoing physical symptoms. You might see, like, say, tummy aches as a classic one, big emotions, and difficult behaviors in children. And traumatic experiences can cause toxic stress. So part of what's so damaging about ongoing trauma is it leads to this ongoing elevated stress response, and that can have toxic effects on our brain and body long term. Okay. And like something that's key to understand is that two children, as I mentioned before, could go through the same type of traumatic event. Let's say it was a single incident trauma, like maybe a car accident or something, And depending on what supports they have, one child may have toxic stress from that, and another child might have tolerable stress. And we're going to get more into the difference between how we kind of mediate that going forward. But that's just an example to kind of bring to mind for now. The impact of toxic stress is really important because, particularly in children, the immune system is developing, the brain is developing, our body is developing, and we've actually associated adverse childhood experiences with long-term physical health and mental health outcomes. So, literally, we can look at your ACE score, so say it's like a 3 or a 4, and we can predict the likelihood of developing the following conditions relative to the average population. So asthma, heart disease, depression, lung disease, addiction, self-harm, stroke, suicide, anxiety, cancer, PTSD, diabetes, all of these things are increased significantly in people who have experienced childhood trauma.
Hi, Kara. So there is a question here. So when a child has a hard time being in school, they
Mhm.
really want to finish school, but have had such a hard time being in that environment. What is that type of stress?
Right. Um, It's hard to say because I don't have more context on, like, what are the behaviors, what are they experiencing. I think that when I talk about kind of what makes the difference, that might give a bit, like, between tolerable and toxic, that might give a bit more context here. So I'll go back to that question, after I differentiate the 2, and then maybe that'll make it more clear what I mean there. Alright. Yeah, perfect. So for example here, depression. So the CDC, Center for Disease Control in the United States, estimates that 44% of cases of depression would be eliminated or gone. It's almost 50% of people who have depression would not experience depression had they not experienced childhood trauma. So it's very interconnected here. For self-harm, you're 10 times more likely to experience self-harm in your life. If you've had childhood trauma, you're much more likely to attempt or die by suicide. But it's also things like heart disease, lung disease, stroke, cancer. It's physical health conditions as well. You're much more likely to experience these if you've gone through childhood trauma. And why I share this is to really emphasize just how profoundly toxic stress, that elevated stress response, how much that can damage our bodies and our brains and, our immune systems going forward. And that this is a public health issue. It's not just, isolated to mental health care. It's our health and well-being as a whole. Okay. So I'm going to talk about now what is the difference between tolerable and toxic stress. And that question that was asking, like, how do I tell which type it is? We're not always going to be able to tell if it's a tolerable or toxic level of stress for someone. But what makes the difference between the two is consistently supportive and caring adults. Okay. And what that means is that if two children go through something hard, so let's say two children are really struggling in school, maybe getting bullied a lot, feel unsupported, feel really afraid to go to school, whatever it might be. But one child has consistently supportive, caring adults, or even just one really consistently supportive, caring adults, that would be that type of stress is likely to be tolerable stress compared to toxic stress because healthy, supportive relationships with adults have been shown to be healing and have been shown to help us kind of de escalate, get out of that toxic stress response, even if we have to like go back into that environment. Okay. It doesn't mean that there's going to be no impact from that, but it does mean that relationships, like this is really powerful. Healthy, supportive, caring relationships with children make a huge difference. Like they've literally shown it can help heal the brains and bodies of children, even if you can't control all the hard situations that they go through. So, for example, the quote that I gave in the description of this webinar from Gabor Maté, who's quite renowned in his treatment of trauma and an expert in the field of trauma, he talks about how safety is not the absence of threat. So you're never going to be able to keep kids safe all the time. We obviously want to prevent anything we can that causes harm to kids, but there is going to be threat and difficulty and danger and hard situations that kids experience. But the good news is that safety can come through connection. So even if we can't prevent every possible threat or bad thing that happens, we can be present and connected with people. And even in my own life, having lost a loved one to suicide, I remember I used to always want to try to fix all her problems. I wanted to be like, how can I like help fix what's going on or take away what's going on? But in hindsight, I realized what she needed was actually my presence and connection, even if I couldn't solve the problems that she was going through. Because if people feel less alone, children and adults included, they are better able to cope with and get through adversity. Connection builds resilience. They've done studies that for both emotional pain and physical pain, if you have someone with you that you have a strong, caring, positive relationship with, your perception of that pain is actually diminished. The aloneness is what makes things especially painful, is what makes stress toxic. Okay. So being alone in the hard things is what causes toxic stress. Okay. And it doesn't mean that children are not going to be affected by, difficult things if they have positive, caring adults in their life. But it does mean the impact of, the toxicity of that stress is going to be limited. And again, it doesn't mean like it's obviously going to be most powerful from caregivers, but even just having a teacher or a childcare worker who has this emotional safety, who creates safety for children, it does matter. It does make an impact. And hopefully that feels like more of a relief than something heavy to carry, because the fact is that you just creating safety whenever you are with that child can be very protective for them, even if you can't fix or change the hard situation that they're in. It matters and it makes a difference. I think I see some more questions here if there are any. Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Good to move forward?
Yeah, we're just gonna wait till the end. It goes with that initial question, there's just a little more context, but go
Yeah,
ahead,
for sure.
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Okay. We just check our time here. Perfect. Okay. So, like I said, your presence matters. And hopefully that is really reassuring. It is hopefully something that feels empowers you that you can make a difference for the kids you're interacting with in both personal and professional roles, because the research is very clear that consistent nurturing relationship with adults can lessen or even heal the impacts of toxic stress. It doesn't mean it's going to take away every negative behavior. It doesn't mean that children aren't going to struggle, but it does mean it can lessen or even heal, as I said, the impacts of toxic stress. Okay. So, a couple things to note when working with children, with young children, is that children who experience toxic stress, and we don't always know who's experiencing that, are in that chronically elevated fight or flight response, or coming out of that situation, or even still in that situation, are going to be more easily stressed or overwhelmed than other children. And what that means is you're probably going to see more difficult behaviors in those children. You might notice that they are a lot more angry. Maybe they're hitting other children. Maybe they're throwing things. You're going to notice that they might be a lot more anxious, might be a lot more sad or shut down, that kind of thing, not willing to participate. But the big thing is when we respond to big emotions or big behaviors, and help children feel safe by how we respond to them, it can make stress more tolerable for them. It can help them manage and regulate these emotions, etc. So it's important how we respond to difficult behaviors and big emotions in kids. And so I'm going to give you some strategies for that. But we're going to start with looking at the emotional brain versus the thinking brain, because this is important. This is relevant for adults too, but even for little kids, under the age of 5, this is still really relevant. They still have this prefrontal cortex, this frontal lobe, which is the kind of rational part of their brain, as rational as they can be at that age, and the emotional part of their brain. Okay. And this is important to understand because for all humans, when our emotional brain is online, when a kid is in the midst of a tantrum, that part of their brain is fully taken over. That thinking part of their brain that's more rational, that can understand, okay, yeah, I can't have this toy, or I can't get this candy, whatever it might be, is not going to rationally be taking over at that point. It's going to totally be the emotional part of that brain. We're just fully in the tantrum. You can't reason them out of it, just like you couldn't reason an adult out of their anger if you tell them to calm down when they're really angry, right? So the emotional brain is also like a relational brain in the sense that we pick up cues from our environment of whether or not we're safe with someone. The emotional part of the brain for kids can become overactive, so they can have those big emotions. They can kind of be triggered to go to that place when discipline is focusing on alienating or isolating them or on punishment. So, punishment, like you need to be disciplined or punished for this, can actually be quite triggering for kids that have gone through a lot of trauma, especially if they've learned that, if I do something wrong, I get yelled at. If I don't do this the right way, I get in trouble. Like there can be a lot of fear of getting in trouble because that may have led to emotional, verbal, or physical abuse as a result. So the sense of punishment can be very overwhelming and triggering. Too many transitions or not enough time to make transitions can make children feel unsafe, can make them feel overwhelmed. If they feel ignored or rejected by caregivers, if there's not enough one on one time or support, or feeling that they are bad, that their feelings are wrong, that they're not validated, that kind of thing. So, children, just like adults, are wired to need connection to feel safe. And we'll go deeper into what I mean by connection as we go forward. But when this emotional part is fully taken over, is what is running the show here when they're in a tantrum, what kids need before like correction or discipline or accountability. They need connection. They need to know that they're not alone in these big feelings. A lot of what we talk about in therapy when I'm working with adults is how kids experience or adults experience these wounds as kids where they were alone in really big hard emotions, and that continue to cause issues long term for them, where they continue to feel like their emotions don't matter, that that they shouldn't ask for help from other people, that they can't set boundaries, and a lot of those things are learned in childhood. And so it's really important how we respond as adults. The thinking part of the brain is what's going to come online when we're trying to problem solve with children, as developmentally appropriate, of course. Like, okay, instead of throwing the toys, what could we do instead when we're feeling angry? Let's figure out a way to do that. So, like, you can teach and model healthy ways to regulate emotions, but you can't do that when kids are in full blown meltdown, tantrum phase, etc. And I think it's really important to remember that when that emotional brain is taken over, it's not necessarily that children won't do what you're asking them to do. It's probably they can't because that emotional part of their brain is totally taken over. And the other thing to remember too is that are your expectations of emotional regulation developmentally appropriate? Because if a child is 2 years old or 3 years old, they're not going to have the same capacity to cope with things as we would. So, yes, the fact that you peeled their banana the wrong way is going to be really hard to deal with, really overwhelming. Whereas, as an adult, we're probably going to be okay if the banana isn't peeled the way we want it to be, right? So, we have to look at what's developmentally appropriate in terms of our expectations, in terms of how frustrated we get with certain emotional expressions. Is there a question?
There is just one of the participants would like for you to, and it's probably a part of your conversation, but how can we positively connect with kids who have or are experienced trauma?
Yes, absolutely. So, great question. I'm going to give you a specific framework, like 1, 2, 3 steps to walk through to respond to kids' difficult behaviors or emotions, just kind of setting up like the theory behind it right now. But that's really important. And if you feel that there needs to be more clarification before the end of the presentation, please let me know and I'll go into it in more detail. Okay. And oftentimes, children need help to learn how to manage their emotions, especially if they've come from an environment where they're not being taught how to manage their emotions. Maybe the caregivers or adults in their life don't have the capacity to do that, or aren't creating a safe environment, and they don't know what to do with these emotions. And sometimes kids suppress their emotions in unsafe environments because that would get them in trouble if they showed those big emotions. But then when they feel safe, you get all the difficult behaviors, which can be hard. When you're a safe person to a kid, you might actually experience a lot more of their difficult behaviors because, oh, I can show these things to this person, right? And I'm not going to be like punished or hurt for that, which can be hard because then you kind of get the brunt of some difficult behaviors. But the heart of why I want to explain this whole like feeling brain, thinking brain is we cannot seek accountability or teach or discipline when children are in that emotional state. And that's true for adults too. So we create safety through connection instead. So a simple way to remember this, and I'll go back to this in a second. Oh, wait, is basically connection before correction. So before you're trying to correct a child's behavior, we need to connect with them. Something that I also like to touch on is that the development of the brain is happening until you're like 25 years old for people. Trauma can actually stunt this growth. So you might see even like a 5-year-old who has the emotional capacity of a 2-year-old. And it's not because they're a bad child or there's something wrong with them. It's just that they haven't been taught those skills or haven't had emotionally nurturing, safe environments to help them be able to have their brain, grow in a healthy way. So they're maybe acting at a level of being 2 years old emotionally. It's not because, they just are, grumpy because they're not getting what they want or they're being spoiled or whatever it might be. It's that that's just where their development stopped in that area because of the trauma they've experienced. And I think the heart of it is like instead of jumping to judgment or frustration with difficult behaviors in kids, we need to go to curiosity, compassion, and empathy. What's going on for this child? How might this behavior actually make sense given what the child has gone through? And not going to like, oh, they're just being difficult to be difficult, right? So, some examples of stress response behaviors in young children would be like crying. This list isn't exhaustive either, but crying, screaming, running away, not wanting to be touched, like pushing away, arching the back, hiding, kind of disconnected, staring blankly, being really irritable, restlessness, unable to settle, unable to stop moving. Sometimes being overly helpful can be part of what we call a fawn response, and I'll go a bit more into that in a moment. Being really clingy or really like attached to a caregiver, to a point that is perhaps a bit unhealthy. It's not unhealthy for kids to, want to be close to their caregivers, but if there's a sense of, I'm afraid to do anything on my own, there might be something there. Pushing others, throwing things, fidgeting, squirming, constantly saying no, even though it can be normal for toddlers to just say no all the time, just, because that's a thing. But when we're talking about like ongoing, just like defiance and pushing back and being really, just like hard to work with, that can be something that comes from a stress response in kids. And here's the thing. So I was just talking with a parent the other day about she has a son who will get really overwhelmed, really dysregulated, will have tantrums, even though it's not really appropriate for his age to really have those tantrums. I think he was like 5 or so, and it was more like a tantrum of like a toddler. And she was like, "I don't know why he's having these tantrums. Like I can't figure out," and they can't tell me the reason why they're having these tantrums or like what's going on, that kind of thing. And part of it is like we don't need to find the why in order to help connect and regulate a kid when they're in a tantrum. And it's not always the most important thing about what's going on. Like maybe we never find the reason for some of these things, but we can still help the kids be calm and regulated or even just feel safe. And sometimes, even when we practice being trauma informed with kids, they're still going to have difficult behaviors. And it's not just going to be, okay, behavior resolved, and that isn't necessarily the goal here. The goal is helping them feel safe because you have a pattern of responding in a nurturing, supportive way. Okay. It's not just about eliminating difficult behaviors, it's about like meeting them in those behaviors, being a safe person, even when those difficult behaviors come out. And that's where that can really make a difference. Behind every behavior, especially difficult behaviors, is a feeling. And those feelings come from a place that makes sense most of the time, even if we don't get to know what that emotion is. So, even if a child goes to daycare every day and normally they love it there, and then all of a sudden they're throwing tantrums, they don't want to go, they're really overwhelmed by it. And you might think, well, you love going and this wasn't a problem before, so why are you upset? Maybe there's anxiety there. Maybe there's a new fear there. Maybe there's some anger about, like, I don't want you to have to go to work today. I want to be with you today. And you know what? It might not make sense. It might be just be a new thing that happens, but we want to try to connect with that feeling instead of just being like, this is a bad behavior, right? This is a behavior that we need to just kind of like get rid of. It's like, no, what's going on for this child emotionally right now?
I just one of the participants was wondering, um, asking if all of this information applies to kids up to the age of 25. They write, I realize that the term young children means younger children, but often kids start some of the negative behaviors in their teens. I realize that the starting connection and being trauma informed at a young age is more preventative, but I'm curious if this applies to older children too.
Yeah, I think it does, obviously, just in developmentally appropriate ways. Like, you wouldn't obviously talk to your teenager in the same way you might talk to your 5-year-old. But I think that the principles are the same in the sense that um, with teenagers, difficult behaviors often come from a feeling, come from stress, come from feeling overwhelmed. which is interesting, right? Because if you have a teenager who's really angry with you, who's being really defiant, who's being kind of aggressive, it's like, ugh, why are they being so difficult? Like, what's wrong with them? Why can't they just be more respectful? It's like, if we dig deeper there, there's probably something fueling that anger. And it might have nothing to do with you. It doesn't mean you've done something wrong if you're seeing a difficult behavior in children or youth. It likely is coming from somewhere else, unless you are, like being unkind to them. But a lot of the times, these big emotions actually don't have anything to do with us, but we're on the brunt of the receiving end, right? But if we can remain calm and compassionate and have some curiosity and empathy about what's going on for people, that's when we can really get to the heart of like how to support people. And here's the thing, even with youth or children, even if you do everything right, it may not slow the duration of a difficult behavior. They may still be angry at you, they may still be upset about the situation, but you still can have created safety in that moment. And what I mean by that is you've shown them that you are not going to get angry at them being angry. We all get angry sometimes with our kids. I'm talking about a pattern here, but you're not going to get angry at them being angry. You're not going to tell them they're not allowed to feel anxious about things, that they're not allowed to cry about things, they're not allowed to feel certain ways. Even if they have difficult behaviors that persist, it's saying, you know what? I can be with you in this difficult behavior. I can be with you in this hard place. And that has a long term effect over time, even if you're still seeing difficult behaviors. So don't feel like, oh, if I'm doing this right, I'll never see difficult behaviors. That's not true. There's still going to be things that are hard. But again, it's how we respond to those behaviors that we're trying to focus on here to create safety. Okay, so fight response, flight response, freeze response, and fawn response. We will see these in kids, even under the age of 5. We will see them in youth. We will see these in adults. So a fight response in children could look like throwing things, hitting, biting, whatever it might be. Um, with a fight response, typically that is our brain saying, I feel overwhelmed or threatened by something. So maybe another kid took my toy and I'm really frustrated by it. And I just like push them because I'm like, no, you can't do that. You can't treat me that way. And so for being developmentally appropriate for that child is, that makes sense that they would do that because they're angry about, the toy. And in that moment when they're angry right after they've, pushed the kid, that's not when we say, don't do that, stop that, etc., etc. We want to kind of understand, okay, so it seems like you're feeling angry. And I'm going to go over this in more detail. But the anger response is essentially trying to take control of a situation where you feel powerless. And you might say, it's a toy. But to a child, that's a big thing. I know that once I was working with a teenage girl and she was really upset that a friend hadn't texted her back for a day and she was actually quite distraught about it. And my instinctive response was, it's not that big of a deal, just like text her and ask her if she got your text, right? But then I have to stop myself and say, actually, it's quite developmentally appropriate for a teenager to be upset about this. This is a very normal thing to matter a lot to them based on their life experiences, based on where they're at in terms of their development and what's important to them. And so, yeah, it makes sense if a child feels that they're out of control because another child took their toy. Yeah, anger makes sense. And what we want kids to know and adults is that all emotions are allowed. All emotions are allowed, but not every expression of emotion is helpful or allowed, right? So you're allowed to get angry that someone took your toy, but you're not allowed to hit, okay? You're not allowed to push. You're not allowed to throw at people, okay? And so the anger is allowed, but we try to find a different way to express it. Similarly, with the flight response, anxiety, if a kid's feeling really overwhelmed and it might seem something small to us, like, that they aren't letting her play with these toys, or, mom's going to work today and normally that's fine, but I feel really overwhelmed and scared without mom today. So I'm going to be really anxious and really overwhelmed. That could be the flight response. Okay. And I want you to think about the times where you felt this way. When have you gotten angry? When have you become anxious? When have you shut down? When have you gone into people pleasing? Because these are trauma responses that we can have too, or stress responses that we can have. So we can relate to that a little bit when we feel overwhelmed, stressed, scared. Some of these responses can come out for us. So the last response, or the last two responses we're going to look at, are freeze response and fawn response. So the freeze response is we're sad, we're shutting down, we're disconnected. And typically in trauma, there's a hierarchy here. If you cannot overpower the threat before you or like attack head on, which would be anger, it's like, I'm going to go take control of the situation. Then our brain goes to, can I escape this situation, which is anxiety, run away, right? So, can I escape it or can I overpower it? If your brain cannot escape the situation through running away or through overpowering the threat, you shut down. You go into a place of learned helplessness, you go into a place of disconnected. So this is where you might see kids really disengaged, not really talking much, just like being really isolated from other kids, that kind of thing. And then the last response that we might see in both adults and children is people pleasing. So if you have to keep the adults in your life happy in order to remain safe, so if you are just invisible or always doing the good thing or the right thing, and that way you don't get harmed verbally or emotionally or physically, then you're going to get the message that I need to keep everyone else around me happy. And so even if you see kids being overly helpful, sometimes that can be a worrisome response too, right? Doesn't mean all the time that that's a worrisome response, but it can be a sign of a fawn response or a people pleasing response. Okay. So, like we talked about, fight response here, and these will just be the slides. You can go over them in a little bit more detail later. And these might be some things you might relate to as an adult as well. But like I said before, we need connection, not correction. When children are acting in challenging ways, it's really easy to become frustrated and want to punish these behaviors. But in these moments, they need connection, not correction. How do we do that? So, first step, we want to make sure that when we're seeing difficult behaviors in children, we recognize that these difficult behaviors may be a result of childhood trauma or other traumatic or other difficulties in their life, as opposed to these are just willful bad behavior that needs to be punished. Okay. It can be easy to think, oh, like, am I being manipulated here? Or where's this behavior coming from? But it's really important we recognize that, every child at heart is good. They're doing the best they can with the situation before them. How can I support them? Not like, how can I, just eliminate this hard behavior, discipline them, whatever it might be. I'm going to go back to this in a second. Children are not using big emotions to manipulate you, okay? And you might say, yes, they are. They want a certain behavior out of me. They want to get something that they want. And with manipulation, sometimes people learn that that's what they have to do in order to get their needs met. So I've worked with people that have had to, if they've experienced emotional or physical neglect, they've had to quote unquote manipulate to get their needs met because they wouldn't be met otherwise. So children might actually just be doing what they need to do in order to, get what they need or want in a situation because they've been taught that's the only way it's going to happen, right? And I think it's really important that we know that kids' big emotions are a reflection of something they're struggling with. It's not meant to be a power struggle between you and them. When you see a big emotion, when you see a difficult behavior, we want to say, okay, what's underneath this? How do I connect with them in this moment? Not just how do I, again, correct or discipline here. Children do not become spoiled or weak from being comforted when they're upset. Kids need comfort when they have big emotions, when they're angry, when they're sad, when they're anxious, anything like that. Okay. It's often in those moments of emotional safety that kids learn that their emotions are tolerable, that they can cope with them, that they can regulate them. And there's a phrase that our calm can be contagious as adults in the lives of kids. Big behaviors typically come from big emotions, which come from feeling overwhelmed and unsafe. Even if we don't understand why a child feels overwhelmed and unsafe, you don't need to know the reason to be able to comfort that child, okay? We can't always fix the things that are making children upset, or they might seem silly or small to us, but they're big to them, and that's what matters. And just like adults, children cannot think rationally or problem solve or figure out a different way to cope when they're in the midst of that tantrum or feeling completely overwhelmed, okay? So I want to skip this for a second because I want to go to the heart of what we're wanting to get is like, how do I support kids in their emotions here? Okay. So I want you to avoid these things during big emotions. Okay. Like I've said, teaching or correcting, punishment or discipline, reasoning or explaining why, negotiating behaviors. So that could look like the following things: calm down, stop yelling, don't cry, sending kids to timeout or isolation, that kind of thing. So, what do we need to do first here? So first is regulating our own emotions here, okay? And so when you see a difficult behavior in a kid, when you are overwhelmed by what's going on with them, we want to try to respond instead of react, okay? And what the difference there is reacting is really instinctive, it's quick, it comes from our own stress response where we might just say, stop it, don't do that, why are you doing that, that kind of thing. And there will always be times that we react. You don't need to be perfect to do this kind of stuff. And the good thing is even if you react where you say, you know what, calm down or stop doing that, or you like jump to discipline or correction, if you can take a moment after that, you can say, you know what? Actually, I'm going to kind of backtrack here and I'm going to take a different approach now. It doesn't mean you've ruined the whole interaction if you respond quickly, instinctively from your own place of stress. You can stop and change how you're acting once you've had a moment to kind of respond. I don't know if you can hear my son in the background downstairs, but hopefully not. He's just kind of yelling right now. Well, he's playing, but he's just loud. Anyways, so remaining calm helps children to calm and regulate big emotions. So calm can be contagious. So one of the most helpful things you can do, which sounds super simple, is just remaining calm when a kid is having a big emotion. Okay. So when they're, anxious or they're angry or they're disconnected, if you just need to pause and take a breath, set an intention to be present and compassionate, take that time for a moment. It might only be 5 seconds, but try best you can to pause, kind of reorient things. And we want to speak slowly, softly, and with warmth and kindness. Okay. So that's the first step is regulating your emotions. And I'm going to give you, so take a moment to do that, then move forward in this interaction. Okay. The next thing, which I've already mentioned, is all emotions are allowed. So what that means is we don't want kids to get the message that they're bad or their emotions are bad if they're expressing, big emotions. So it's okay to just say, it seems like you feel really sad right now. Or you're feeling angry because Jenna took your toy without asking. It's okay to be angry. And maybe we've never got this message and this seems really foreign and different to us, but all emotions are allowed, but not every expression of emotion is helpful. Okay, so kids are allowed to feel all these things, and we are going to feel these things as humans, as adults, as kids. And we want to just validate and say, hey, it's okay to feel this way, or this is really scary for you right now, or this is hard. And if you don't know what emotion is going on for the child, it's okay to just say, hey, it's okay if feels like too much right now, or I can see that so much is happening and there's such big feelings right now, or you're frustrated that we can't go outside right now. Like that's allowed. Like even just saying those kind of things, validating the emotion. So regulating ourselves, keeping our calm to be contagious, which can help de-escalate the situation, keep children calm around us. We validate and allow the emotion. And then we just want to do something to soothe their distress. We don't have to immediately go to try to correct the behavior, like I said. We might want to, if they're young, if they're quite young, like under 1, that kind of thing, we might offer to hold and rock them. Just offer. If they don't want to, that's okay. Some kids might need space. Maybe it's rubbing their back, holding their hands, humming a soft melody, offering a comforting toy, telling them simple things like, hey, I'm here with you and you're safe with me. You're not alone. This is a big hard emotion. I just want you to know you're not alone with it right now. And again, this kind of process seems really simple, right? It's like, okay, so I just be calm, validate their emotion, and soothe their distress by just doing something comforting. But it's so common for us to instinctively get upset, be in our own stress response, invalidate emotions, stop crying, stop doing that, doing some sort of command or like correction immediately, and not just helping them get through that big emotion. Sometimes kids literally just need 5 minutes or more, sometimes it's a lot more, of just being upset, of just being overwhelmed, of having that tantrum, whatever it might be. Be present with them in it, allow them to be in that difficult space. And after they're regulated, after they've calmed down, you can do the problem solving. You can figure out ways to move forward. You can figure out, well, how can we do that in a way that might be like more helpful going forward? It's not okay to hit. It's not okay to throw things at people. It's not okay to do A, B, or C. But we need to figure out a new way forward. But I can't do that when you're in the midst of feeling distressed. So if a child has run away and hid because they're feeling anxious or overwhelmed, you can go approach, hey, it seems like you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Like, would you like this toy? I just want you to know, like, I can see big emotions in you. I want you to know you're safe here with me. You're not alone. Can I just sit with you here? Maybe I'll hum a song that we like, whatever it might be, right? And so the goal is not to immediately correct or fix the situation. It's literally about being present with kids in their emotions. It's connecting with them, understanding them, trying to simply just be there with them, be present with them while they're going through hard emotions. So even like my son, who's 10 months old, um, the other day he was like really upset and he wouldn't stop crying and we didn't know why he was crying all the time. And I just picked him up and kind of rocked him and like patted his back probably for like 10 or 15 minutes because he was just upset and we couldn't figure out why. And I just kept saying, "Hey, I know this is something feels really big right now. I'm here with you. I know it's hard." And probably just said that like so many times, just patted his back, just got him through it until he was in more of a calm state again. We put on, a TV show he likes just to like help him kind of like be distracted for a bit. And again, I still don't know why he was upset, but it was just about like being there. And even if I can't immediately fix the crying, fix the behavior, make it go away, I can show him that I'm a safe person in that moment, that I'm okay and I'm willing to be in hard places with him when those hard emotions come up. It's not just like, stop crying, there's nothing wrong here. It's like, no, you have a big emotion that matters. And I'm going to do my best to comfort you and soothe you through that. And of course, when they're older, we can obviously look at, okay, are there difficult behaviors attached to this? Okay, we need to figure out a different way when we're getting angry to express that because this doesn't really work. We want everyone to feel safe here, right? So again, regulate, which is easier said than done and is a lot more complex than just like regulate. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And we want to validate, just like, hey, it seems like there's a big emotion here, be present with them, soothe their distress. And hopefully, again, this is a relief in some ways, that it's not like you have to figure it all out. Like, you don't know why they're tantruming, you don't know why they're overwhelmed. Even if you don't find the reason, you can still be a soothing, nurturing presence in those emotions. And I hope that that gives a bit of context about what this might look like. Okay. Is there another question that just came up? I just can't see it there.
They're asking if the slides will be available after, and I will be sending those out.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, let me just check our time here. Okay. So I'm going to go back here for a moment. So I'm going to just show you this concept called the rainbow of emotional regulation. It might be helpful for you to remember just as like an illustration. Okay. So kids are able to listen and learn when they are in their rainbow of tolerance. You may have heard of something called a window of tolerance, but this is a little bit different in the sense that it's a rainbow of tolerance. It's a little more kid friendly. So when kids are in that space, that's when they're able to be like, oh yeah, I can kind of like figure out like maybe I need to say sorry here, or like I shouldn't bite someone else, or like, jumping down on the floor and kicking my legs and feet isn't maybe the most helpful way to communicate what I need, those kind of things, right? But when kids start to get to a more stormy place, that's kind of what I kind of use for big emotions. When they get to a really stormy place, that's when we need to take a break. We need to validate. We need to just soothe, connect, and comfort until they're back in that rainbow of tolerance, until they're back in that place where they're more calm and regulated, where the big emotion, where the emotional brain hasn't completely taken over. Okay. So when someone is in a stormy place or a big emotion place, that's where we have to just focus on getting them back into the rainbow, into a place of being calm before we can do any sort of teaching about like, how do we manage our emotions in a healthy way before we go into that place. So hopefully this little graphic can be helpful as well. The other thing to notice is that there often is a zone or a sign that things are starting to get cloudy before things get stormy. So if you're starting to notice that a kid is starting to get irritable or starting to get kind of anxious, just like noticing signs of that before they're in a full-blown meltdown or showing a lot of difficult behaviors, if you can help kind of bring them back into that rainbow of tolerance, then you can probably prevent a full-blown meltdown. Not always, but sometimes. So try to pay attention. Are there initial signs that this kid is starting to feel anxious or disconnected or angry here? Maybe they're just starting to be a bit more irritable with other kids. Like, no, I'm not giving you that, things like that, or starting to be kind of like, you know, less interactive with the other kids, maybe starting not to speak as much. We can try to say, hey, just give them a bit more attention, a bit more connection, and bring them back into this moment, into a regulated, calm rainbow space. Okay. I was going to say something, but I lost my train of thought there. But essentially, we need to be in that calm place for our thinking brain to be back online. So hopefully that gives like a helpful kind of metaphor or explanation as to what might be going on with kids. Okay. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is principles of trauma informed care, which are relevant across all age groups. So, one of the most important things about being trauma informed is acknowledging the impact of trauma and being aware of the impact of trauma, which you're doing even just by taking this webinar of what a stress response and a trauma response can look like in children or in yourself. Creating a sense of emotional safety, which is what we just talked about in terms of regulating our own response, validating emotions, and soothing. Creating trust, so being a trusting, safe adult for kids, giving kids some choice and control. And what that means is like kids still need structure and guidance from us. And we can't just give them like free reign, but it does mean we value their perspectives and we try to make decisions with them. We're like, what would you like if we were going to do this? Could we go try this or that? Right? Like showing them that their choices matter, that having control over things matters. Because when kids and adults experience trauma, they feel very powerless, like they can't influence what's going to happen. So kids knowing that they can have some choice and control, even if it's over small things, can go a long way. Collaboration, again, in trauma, our voices, our perspectives are often said, that doesn't matter. When you are a kid or an adult and you say, I don't want this to happen, but it still happens to you, it kind of tells you, my voice doesn't matter, what I think doesn't matter. And so by showing kids that you value and care about their perspective, that can make a big difference. And my favorite part of being trauma informed is taking a strengths based approach. So, again, this is like we're looking at children and we're not saying, oh, you're a bad kid because of bad behaviors. No, bad behaviors, in quotations, or difficult behaviors come from big emotions. Big emotions come from the experiences you've had. Even if I don't know why you're overwhelmed, even if I can't find a reason right away or fix what's going on, this behavior likely makes sense if I were to dig deeper, and your emotions and your emotional distress matters regardless of where it's coming from.
Thanks, Kara. I think you might have answered some of this, but this question is, what advice can you give for witnessing a parent that does not validate their children's feelings or behaviors?
Yeah.
This person attempted to address this parental behavior once before and they became defensive.
Yeah. Oh, that's really hard. Um, so first and foremost, I just want to reiterate that if you are still being like creating that emotional safety with that kid, even when the parent's not around, that matters. And that can be really helpful and protective for that kid. Um, I think like parenting is such a sensitive issue for so many of us. A lot of us have shame around it or guilt or feel like we're not doing enough. So it can be really, really sensitive for people. And people can be afraid of feeling like they're doing the wrong thing or being told that they might be doing the wrong thing. So typically, a couple things I recommend there is if you can model the behavior in front of the parent, that might be a way to kind of slowly influence that. The second thing, though, is if they weren't receptive to that, if you probably don't mean this to be unhelpful, but sometimes when we respond to our kids' emotions that way, it doesn't land how we want it to. And trying to approach it from a really supportive way. Sometimes parents still won't be receptive or in the place to make those changes. And sometimes, and this may sound like not a great answer, but sometimes we can't control those things, right? Like we can't necessarily change how a kid is being parented. The best thing we can do is model the behavior, continue to be a nurturing adult to that child, and encourage the parent towards being more nurturing and responding differently to emotions. But when we ever do approach that conversation with a parent, we need to make sure that it doesn't seem blamey or like criticizing. And maybe we start with like, I know that parenting is really hard and I think you're doing a really good job. It's just sometimes we don't realize how certain things might come across for kids. So just making sure you can give that advice or feedback as safely as possible, where you're not like shaming or blaming the parent, because a lot of us have a lot of baggage around parenting and feeling that shame and guilt. So trying to have it in a supportive kind of non-criticism, non-judgmental way is super important when you do. But again, we can't always change those things, and I think that's really hard. So, yeah. So hopefully that gave a bit of context there. Okay. All right, let me just see our time here. Okay. So the last thing that I want to touch on, because I think this is crucial, just jump through here. So, as I said before, just to reiterate, because it's a key point, teachable moments come after. Only after the child is regulated or no longer showing big emotions can we explain why certain behaviors are not okay, help them to problem solve, and repair any harm that was done. Okay. But the other big part that we really need to emphasize is that in order to offer trauma informed care to children, we have to tend to our own needs and mental health as well. And I think that this is a huge topic because caring for our own mental health is really complicated. We have a lot of our own stuff going on. We may have experienced childhood trauma, which makes us more likely to go into our own stress responses or trauma responses. Just know that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to repair things with children afterwards, and it can go a long way. And even if you feel like, okay, I haven't responded in a way that's been helpful in the past to kids, the relationship's not too far gone. Okay. You can change the way you interact in a relationship, even if you have been acting in a different way for the majority of the time beforehand. So it's not too far gone. You can still make changes. You are not a bad person, a bad parent, a bad caregiver, a bad, childcare worker, whatever it might be, even if you have responded differently than how I talked about today. There are other ways to respond in good ways beyond just what I said. I'm just giving you a framework to go with. But just know that my personal philosophy is we do the best we can until we know better. And when we know better, we do better. Maybe you weren't equipped in terms of how to support kids emotionally. Maybe, it's been really hard to know how to approach some really big, difficult behaviors because it triggers something in you, or you were treated the same way when you had similar behaviors. It could be so many things. So just know it's not about shaming and blaming you if you have acted differently. And no one responds perfectly to big behaviors and emotions all the time. It's really stressful when kids have big emotions and it can trigger our own stuff. So you don't need perfection here. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to try to repair and change things and just do the best we can to move forward within our capacity. So I just want to take a note of that too. So my last little bit here is I just want you to, oh, is there a question? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Okay. Do you agree that these techniques, regulate, validate, soothe, may need to be done between a child and parent caregiver many times? This person's found in families that they've worked with that they need to equip parents with the support to do this consistently and repetitively over months and years to build that consistent safety.
Right. So I'm going to go here. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think it's like it takes time to learn these strategies and approaches and to create a pattern when, and for children to learn, okay, this is how my caregiver might respond most of the time to me. Because again, sometimes we're going to respond with our own big emotions and things. But I think that I would definitely say repetition is important and teaching these things is important. And, I think though that like when I was talking about the shame and blame thing, I think that there can be a lot of like fear and a lot of shame that gets in the way when we're being told like this is how you should parent and this is what you were doing wrong before. So it's really important how we approach those conversations with like this is how you need to do this. um so I guess what I'm saying in the end is coming from a supportive non-judgmental place is key, but yes, it probably has to be done repetitively in order to have like the positive protective long-term effects. So it's got to characterize most of the interactions between the adult and child. But again, doesn't mean that we need perfection to have a positive impact on a child through our relationship. So hopefully that gives context. Our last piece here, which may seem like something small and simple, but it's just a reminder that only from a place where we're tending to our own needs and our own well-being can we help regulate children and help be calm, let our calm be contagious, that kind of thing. If we're really struggling, if we're really overwhelmed, of course we're going to go into a place of reacting instead of responding, right? So, couple reminders here for you, whether this is personal or professional. Be aware of signs that you are stressed out before there is a big emotion or difficult behavior in a child. So, for example, maybe you're starting to feel a lot more guilt or shame, or like you're never doing enough, whether it's at work or at home. Maybe you're feeling chronically exhausted even when you get a good sleep. You might be more irritable and less patience with other people. These are signs that you are starting to feel off kilter, that you yourself are struggling, that something might be off. It's kind of like a red flag. It's like, okay, I need to pay attention to this. I'm more irritable and have less patience with other people. I feel numb or disconnected. Maybe you're finding it hard to empathize with or be compassionate to the children or other people that you're trying to support because compassion fatigue is a real thing. I can't stop thinking or worrying about work or the kids I support. I get overwhelmed easily. Maybe I'm drinking or smoking or taking more medication than usual. All of these things can say, hey, I need to kind of check in with myself and see what I need here because these are signs that I am not getting what I need or that I'm struggling with my mental health or I'm starting to. And if we intervene earlier, instead of when we're in a full-blown crisis or, episode or condition, then we are more likely to recover, more likely to be preventative, that sort of thing. So this is kind of what we can do sometimes, be sitting in a burning room and just be like, this is fine. Everything's okay. We just ignore the problems that we're starting to see in ourselves or what's happening with us. And we just, okay, everything's fine. We'll just deny that there's a problem. So let's try to avoid this if we can. Second thing is it's good to acknowledge what your stressors are and try to be responsive to them. So, a lot of the times, you are probably carrying a lot of things. You might think, oh, I shouldn't be stressed out, or I shouldn't be so overwhelmed, or I should be better at this, or, whatever it might be. But you're probably carrying a lot more than you acknowledge a lot of the time. Stress adds up. And even if it's not one huge, big thing in your life, there might be many things coming together that add up and make things difficult for you. So there's probably stressors weighing on you, and it's important to acknowledge what they are and how they're impacting you. So it's okay to say, "Hey, I'm actually dealing with a lot, and it's understandable that I'm feeling stressed, that I'm feeling overwhelmed, that my mental health is being impacted by this." So even that self-acknowledgement and self-compassion of why you're struggling can be an important step towards moving forward. Asserting boundaries and asking for help can be really important. So, if you need something from other people, can you communicate what you need? If you need help from other people, can you ask for help? Can you say, this is what I need right now? And both of these things can be really hard to do. And sometimes we need to work with a therapist to process through these things and figure out how to do them. Because if we don't say what we need, other people aren't going to be able to meet those needs. And if we don't ask for help, then we are not going to get the help that we need. So those two things can be really important. I'm just gonna move forward here. Lastly, or not lastly, thirdly, sorry, we want to practice self-care strategies. And I know I'm going through this last part quickly. It's just meant to be a reminder to tune in to what you need and be attentive to what you need because you need to take care of yourself in order to take care of children. Okay. And I know that that can be really hard, and there's lots of things that get in the way of caring for ourselves, but their well being and your well being is intertwined. You're not going to be able to be calm, compassionate, and present when they have big emotions, difficult emotions, if you yourself are really struggling. And again, you can't always control how much you're struggling. There's so many things in life that affect mental health. But if there are things you can do, if there are small changes you can make to better tend to your own needs, that can go a long way in your ability to be present with the children in your life. So, domains of self care, looking at your emotional health, your financial health, that can lead to a lot of stress for many of us. Your interpersonal, so how do you relate with yourself? How do you see yourself? The environments you find yourself in, your spiritual well being, whether that's a religious thing or more just like what do I value? What's important to me? Your cognitive health, do you feel challenged? Do you feel like you get a break from the mental workload of life and work? Do you take care of your body and the things that it needs? Do you eat regularly? Do you drink enough water? Do you get enough rest? Those kind of simple things that can profoundly affect our well being, right? And then our last piece here is check in regularly with yourself. What do I need here? How am I doing? What is the smallest step towards wellness that I can take? I might not be able to fix everything, but what's one small thing I can do? Maybe it's sitting in my car 5 minutes before I go inside and see my children or my partner so that I just have a few moments to myself. Maybe that's all we can do sometimes. But just know that your intent and desire to be present with kids when they're going through hard things makes a big difference. Even if you don't do it perfectly all the time, even if you make mistakes, you can have a positive and profound impact on kids that are or have experienced trauma. So I'm going to open up for any other questions that may have come out of this, but I do want to just put in the chat here um, my email so that if you have any questions after today that you didn't get a chance to ask or you wanted to just, kind of reach out and say, what are the resources out there? Or, what are your thoughts on this? That you can do that. So you can email me at kara@oaksmentalhealth.ca. So that's available to you with questions, anything like that. And we'll see what else anyone might be thinking for now. So do we have another question here?
We do. So, how can we help children who have experienced in utero trauma? Often,
Uh,
parents, caregivers are reluctant to disclose this information, yet the child demonstrates big emotions and needs supports and services.
yeah. So I think that's like a really complex question that is probably beyond the scope of what I could answer today. Um, it's not something that I specialize in, and it's not something that I feel like I could answer in a way that would adequately cover that um, in the amount of time that we have left, which probably feels like not a great answer, but I don't want to speak outside of my scope. And I want to make sure that yeah, that I'm not putting, things out there that I'm not quite sure about there. So I'm not sure with that one.
Thanks, Carol. Another question here. What are some resources you would recommend for safe holding of a child who is in the middle of a meltdown and where you have to hold them?
Where you have to hold them. I think that with that one, again, also very complex. So is having to hold them because they could cause harm to other children or because they could cause like property damage, that kind of thing. I guess I'd want to know a little bit more context about why they need to be held in that moment. Like restrained?
Not, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. I just feel like restraint can be really yeah, really overwhelming for people, children included. Um And I usually would say we want to try to use that as a last resort. I'm sure that's being used as a last resort in this context. Um, but I guess I'm just wondering what other strategies might have been tried first and why there's a need to hold the child if they don't want to be held in that moment.
I'm not sure, Erin, if you have response to that.
And it's something you can email me with as well. It's just I feel like I need more context to answer the question.
Oh, so here, sorry, I
Oh,
just missed it here. So, Erin is teaching ECE to students working in a childcare center and got that question. So, doesn't really have
oh,
any other specifics.
Oh, that's fair. I guess I would just ask, if that question was, asked for similar context that I asked for. I think that restraint can like actually escalate a situation a lot of the time with kids. If they can get their own space, if there is a safe space set aside for a kid, that can be more helpful. Um, but I would again recommend that that's a last resort, because even in contexts that I've worked, it seems escalate situations. Suggestions for when kiddo is in meltdown mode and kicking or hitting their parent or caregiver. So I would say in that instance, if you can, I would say, like you're really angry right now, you're really overwhelmed, you're hitting mom or you're hitting dad. That's not allowed. We're not going to do that right now. And I'm going to either step away or I'm just going to say, no, we're like, just like you might have to like grab an arm, something like that, but in a very gentle way, not in like a restraining way. I'm just saying, I'm not going to let you hit mom. I'm not going to let you hit dad, or I'm going to give you some time now, go in the other room, that kind of thing. Remove yourself from the situation. I think that that one can be really hard. And I think that part of what you're going to have to do if you can't stop the hitting or, the aggression in that moment is when the child is in a calm and regulated place, I would talk to them about how, okay, what are we going to do differently when you get that angry again or when you get that overwhelmed because we can't hit or kick mom or dad. You know, that doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel safe, but we want to help you with these big emotions. So, what can we do differently? And so trying to figure that out with a child. Can you, throw this stuffed animal against the wall? Can you rip up some papers? Like, how do we help you deal with the big emotions that are happening? Could we try something else in that moment? And you can't do it when it's in the big emotion, but then afterwards, trying to figure out with them, okay, how can we, prevent this from happening again? But I do want to just reiterate how hard that can be. And it's understandable to be like, I have no idea what to do here because that is a really upsetting, scary, and hard behavior, you know?
Well, thank you so much, Kara. This was gone by so fast. You
Yeah.
will see in the chat how appreciative people are, how valuable the information is, how people are going to be going over the recording.
Mhm.
So that is just a reminder. I will send the recording to all registrants. I will attach the slides so that you can get all that information. When you close the Zoom link, you should automatically receive a survey link. So please help us be able to offer these type of webinars in the future. So just give us some feedback. I will let you know our next early childhood team webinar that we have is on developmental considerations for young children. So that's on March 26th. It's not on our website yet, but will be very soon. So Lee Hinton, who is now our executive director at the Prevention Institute, will be offering that. And thank you, Kara. That was amazing. I have so many notes, learned so much, and extraordinarily appreciative of everything that you were able to give us today. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.